Okay, so we're now on to a piece on the Shackleton's Endurance Diaries by Jonathan Hal Reynolds. Jonathan unfortunately can't join us live today, but he did during the week send us his contribution, which we'll be running. Jonathan is well qualified to speak on this. He's based in Texas. He runs the Explorers Roundtable website, which is well worth looking at. For various modern and past explorers and information on them. He also is a man of many parts in that he runs elite expeditions. He writes novels and books, and he also he lectures in literature and is studying for his PhD. So with that, we will run Jonathan's piece now. I think you'll find it quite interesting. And I'll talk to you afterwards.
Hey guys, I'm Jonathan Reynolds. I'm thrilled to get to be with you all this morning. First of all, a big thank you to Kevin Kinney and those at the Shackleton Museum in Ireland for inviting me to be a part of this special event. Like many of you watching and listening, Ernest Shackleton has been a big inspiration to me through the years, not just because of his place in the history of exploration, but also because of his personal character, the compass of virtues and qualities that he chose to live by. Today I'm going to be talking about Shackleton's journals from the Endurance Expedition. They were published in 1919 as a book called South. I'm going to assume that everyone watching and listening knows the basic history of the expedition and who Ernest Shackleton is. Otherwise, you guys wouldn't be here right now. So I won't be relaying those more general facts, but we'll be talking about how the book South came to be. I'll give a brief overview of its structure and contents, and we'll discuss what its legacy is in the scholarship of exploration and in the field of Shackleton research, which is a growing field these past few decades. To give a little background on the book, Shackleton did not own the rights to the manuscript, whereas most of the benefactors of the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition had written off their loans because of the tragic yet triumphant fate of the voyage. The heirs of Sir Robert Lucas Tooth, who died in 1915, wanted the money back that had been borrowed. So the rights of the book were assigned to the heirs in order to pay back their portion of the loan for the expedition. Shackleton's frequent collaborator, Edward Saunders, who was a reporter in New Zealand, had worked with Shackleton before on his book about the Nimrod expedition, and he was brought on to contribute to South as well. This is someone who respected Shackleton and whom Shackleton could trust, and he is quoted as saying that Shackleton had a remarkable gift of literary suggestion. That's important to note because not only was Shackleton a great leader of men, but he was also recognized during his own time as possessing literary talent, which I'll revisit at the end of this lecture. But also Leonard Hussey, who is part of the Endurance Expedition and was with Ernest when he died a few years later on the way back to Antarctica, did the final editing of the manuscript without taking any payment. So there was a deep loyalty there between these men. Shackleton had a strong editorial team working alongside him. The book's dedication has a sensitivity and thoughtfulness that you would expect from a great leader like Shackleton. His account of the expedition was released to the public in a time of great despair in the wake of World War I. So he begins the book by dedicating it to my comrades who fell in the wide warfare of the South and on the red fields of France and Flanders, end quote. Of the 53 men who survived the expedition, 3 were killed in World War I and 5 were wounded. There's a haunting irony in this, that after surviving the incredible ordeal in Antarctica in a man versus nature situation, an event you would expect to return home from and live out a long life of gratefulness for having survived, a few of these men died shortly after in a man versus man situation, the war. Shackleton himself died of a heart attack just a few years later in January of 1922 at the age of 47 on an expedition back to Antarctica, as I mentioned before. So he begins the book with a sort of reverent dedication and preface, considering the audience to which he was writing and what the world had been through in recent years. He is quick to point out that the expedition did not succeed in its goal, but that there were other worthy attributes of the expedition worth writing about. He said, and I quote, "We failed in this objective, but the story of our attempt is the subject for the following pages. And I think that though failure in the actual accomplishment must be recorded, there are chapters in this book of high adventure, strenuous days, lonely nights, unique experiences, and above all, records of unflinching determination, supreme loyalty, and generous self-sacrifice on the part of my men, which, even in these days that have witnessed the sacrifices of nations, and regardless of self on the part of individuals, still will be of interest to readers who now turn gladly from the red horror of war and the strain of the last 5 years to read, perhaps with more understanding minds, the tale of the white warfare of the South." End quote. Again, there's a good bit of revelation in that passage regarding Shackleton's motivation in writing the book, his mindfulness toward his audience and those he shared his journey alongside, and his hope for the reader. Regarding the structure of the book, there are 18 chapters as well as 2 appendixes. The appendixes mostly have to do with the scientific aspects of the expedition. The titles of the chapters, the 18 chapters, are very straightforward and direct without anything flowery about them. Simple titles like New Land, Ocean Camp, The Rescue. The contents of the chapters go on to describe the purpose of the expedition, how the Endurance took the transcontinental party to the Weddell Sea to cross the Antarctic continent to the Ross Sea by way of the South Pole, which would have been a first and was believed that it would take about 5 months. The Aurora was to take the Ross Sea party to lay out depots along the route that they had planned and assist the transcontinental party in whatever ways they needed. The book describes the Endurance ship's encounter with the pack ice and the ship's eventual sinking. It talks about the escapades at Elephant Island in South Georgia. It gives details about the Ross Sea party and the men who died from exhaustion and falling through the ice. And of course, it examines the events of the eventual rescue. Throughout it all, Shackleton displays the 4 characteristics he claimed were essential to facing the adversities of life. Optimism, which he said was the most important, patience, idealism, and courage. To him, these were necessary not only to surviving extreme conditions such as they experienced on their expedition, but to daily life as well. These qualities were the subject of a recent podcast called What Would Shackleton Do?, created by Dr. Juliana Edelman and the Shackleton Museum director, Kevin Kinney. In it, they paralleled what Shackleton's crew faced on their expedition with our current experience with the COVID-19 pandemic. I highly recommend going and finding it and listening to it. It's a wonderful podcast series. Overall, the book South gives us a primary source for arguably the greatest survival story of all time. It was the foundation for secondary sources such as Alfred Lansing's famous book Endurance, which I believe is the finest ever written about the expedition. And South will continue to be a rich source for researchers for centuries to come. We're forever in debt to Shackleton and his editorial team for taking the time to set down the details of the expedition in writing. And that brings me to the final point I would like to make, that it's impossible to separate the writer, or rather the poet, Ernest Shackleton, from the explorer, Ernest Shackleton. These two forces within him had a symbiotic relationship that enabled him to be a beloved leader, to possess a sensitivity and wit while under extreme stresses, and to be able to communicate his story and experiences in a powerful, concise way as he did in his book, South. In closing, I'll share a brief anecdote to support my final point. In December of 2014, I was on an expedition to Antarctica for the 100th anniversary of the Endurance voyage. And one night, while camping on the ice with Ernest Shackleton's cousin, Jonathan Shackleton, Jonathan told me a story that has always stayed with me and which I recorded in my journal at the time, and I'll relay it here to you all. He said that while Ernest was in South America doing propaganda work just after World War I, around 1919, the same year that his Expedition Diary South was published, Ernest was quoting the poet Robert Browning. And someone who didn't recognize Ernest but acknowledged his uniform said, "I've never known a soldier who had heard of Browning." Later, Ernest was quoting more poetry, and the same man asked, "And who is that one by?" "A fellow named Shackleton," Ernest replied. The man responded, "Oh, the explorer. I didn't know he was a poet too." To which Ernest asked, "Why the devil do you think he became an explorer?" I think that sums up his motivations. But thank you all for watching and listening. It was an honor to be with you today at this meaningful event, and I hope each of you has a lovely autumn and a fruitful journey, and I hope to meet you all in person soon someday. Thank you, and have a wonderful weekend.
Jonathan, I think it's just, as we often see at the Autumn School, when you get an expert in a particular area, and particularly with Jonathan on literature, how he can just sort of strip the layers away, get down to the fundamental points, and invariably, you go through the physical piece, the physical description of the hardships, but you get down to the sort of the spirit at the bottom of it as to what keeps somebody going and what their what are their motivating factors. So that was a really lovely piece. Thanks very much, Jonathan. And certainly we hope to keep in touch with you, and hopefully we can welcome you to Athy at some stage. That last quote, or the last piece that you spoke about the comment from the soldier to Shackleton, I actually think we have the original letter that's in, that was written in. We have that in our archives here in Athy, I think. So if you do get to come here, hopefully we can show you that. A few nice comments. Anne Straighty said she always feels that sad about the death in World War I of Alf Cheetham, who, like Wilde, was a veteran of multiple expeditions. And as Jonathan said, it's great irony in this. And then we have Michelle McKinney, who agrees with the comments about Alfred Lansing's endurance. Okay, so, there's another one. Thanks, Anne Straighty again, who of course is quite an expert on Scotsmen who went to the Great War. The term "the Great White Silence" is from an American poem with which Shackleton and Ponting were familiar and quoted in their books. So that's great. So thanks again. Lots of information coming in, which is what we always like. It's one of the things that happens with the Autumn School. So I think next up we're running a piece from Laura Leonard, who's attended the Autumn School previously, and it's just a research call which she has on a particular piece that is she plans to do some research on. Then we'll be going into a break, and Seamus will be back at 4 o'clock with Seb Coulthard and James Caird. And again, don't forget to refresh your screen at 4 o'clock. Okay, so we'll talk to you then. Thanks very much.
For everybody at Virtually Shackleton 2021, delighted to be here. My name is Laura Leonard, and I have developed an interest in Ernest Shackleton over the recent years. I'm a pharmacist also, so I was just wondering if any in-depth research had been done into the medications, tinctures, treatments that Shackleton bought on his expeditions, or was there a standard portfolio of medications taken with them, or did they pick up from the indigenous native tribes in the Arctic regions? There's been lots of different references in different books over the years about treatments used. For example, on the James Caird voyage, Worsley speaks about Shackleton administering eye drops to soothe Tom Crean's eyes. Anyway, I was just looking for other information that anybody out there might have. The Wellcome Foundation did supply the medicine cabinets to the Endurance and the Quest, so I did get some information from there. But if anybody else has anything, if they could send it on to the Shackleton Museum in Athy, And hopefully this time next year, I might be doing a presentation on it. You never know. Thank you. Bye.